Sweat stained the collar of Officer Harlan Cole's uniform long before the judge's gavel ever fell. He thought it was just another easy collar. Two out-of-towners with the wrong skin color driving through the wrong zip code. He didn't know he'd just handcuffed the United States Navy's deadliest ghosts. Heat radiating from the asphalt warped the taillights of the rented Chevy Tahoe. It was the dead of night on a humid evening in Oak Haven, the kind where breathing felt like swallowing warm cotton. Officer Harlan Cole sat in his cruiser nursing a tepid gas station coffee that tasted faintly of burned plastic and regret. His lower back throbbed after years in a patrol car that had ruined his L4 vertebra, and his ex-wife's lawyer had recently ruined his credit score. He was tired, irritable, and looking for an excuse to exert the only control he had left in his life. The Tahoe rolled past his hidden speed trap, doing exactly 3 miles under the limit. Out-of-state plates, midnight tint. Cole dropped the coffee into the cup holder, threw the cruiser into drive, and flicked on the light bar. Red and blue strobes violently fractured the dark tree line. He didn't have probable cause, but in Oak Haven, a busted tail light he could smash with his heavy mag light after the fact usually sufficed. The Tahoe pulled over smoothly, gravel crunching under heavy tires as it settled onto the shoulder. Cole took his time stepping out. He adjusted his duty belt, the leather creaking in the muggy air, and unclipped the retention strap on his holster. It was a habit born of paranoia and petty authority. He walked up the passenger side, flashlight raised, tapping the trunk to leave a fingerprint protocol he only followed when he wanted to look professional for the dash cam. He shined the blinding beam straight into the driver's side window as it rolled down. License, registration, and proof of insurance. Keep your hands where I can see them, Cole barked. The driver didn't squint. He simply turned his head, his face illuminated by the harsh white glare. He was a black man in his late 30s, clean-shaven, wearing a plain gray t-shirt. His hands rested at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Beside him, the passenger, another black man, slightly broader in the shoulders, stared straight ahead. Neither of them looked surprised. Neither of them looked afraid. "Evening, officer," the driver said. His voice was entirely flat, calm. It lacked the usual tremor of anxiety or the defensive edge Cole was accustomed to dealing with. He slowly moved his right hand toward his chest pocket, producing a wallet with deliberate telegraphed slowness, and extracted a driver's license. Cole snatched it. "Julian Hale. Do you know why I pulled you over, Julian?" Cole asked, leaning closer to the window, sniffing the air. He was looking for the scent of alcohol, weed, anything. He smelled only clean laundry detergent and faint peppermint. "I imagine you'll tell us," Hale replied. The lack of deference made Cole's jaw tighten. "You drifted over the center lines back there. Looked like you were having trouble keeping her straight. Step out of the vehicle." The passenger finally turned his head. "Is that an order or a request, officer?" "It's a lawful command," Cole snapped, bringing his flashlight down to strike the roof of the SUV. The metallic thud echoed in the quiet night. "Both of you, out. Now." Hale sighed a quiet exhalation through his nose. He unbuckled his seatbelt, the click loud in the tense silence. "Elias, let's go. Do exactly as he says." They stepped out. The heat bugs in the ditch screamed a continuous, oscillating drone. Cole directed them to the front of his cruiser. He expected resistance, a raised voice, a sudden movement he could use to justify a takedown. Instead, Hale and Thorne moved with a loose, unnerving efficiency. They spread their legs and placed their hands on the hood of the cruiser without being asked. Cole patted them down. The physical contact made his stomach twist slightly. Underneath their cotton shirts, Their bodies felt like coiled rebar. There was no softness to them, no flinch when Cole roughly kicked Hale's ankles further apart. "What are you boys doing in Oak Haven?" Cole asked, digging his thumbs into Thorne's pockets, pulling out a set of keys and a thick nylon wallet. "Passing through," Thorne said. "Passing through," Cole mocked. "Lot of drugs pass through this county. I'm going to search your vehicle." "I don't consent to a search," Hale said, his voice carrying over the rumble of the cruiser's engine. He didn't turn his head. "We haven't committed a traffic violation. Write your citation or let us go." Cole felt the familiar hot rush of ego flooding his chest. He hated being told the law by people he had in the dirt. He pulled his cuffs off his belt, the metal chains clinking sharply. "You're both under arrest for suspicion of driving under the influence and resisting a lawful investigation." He grabbed Hale's wrists, wrenching them behind his back. Hale didn't resist. He let Cole manipulate his joints, but Cole felt the terrifying latent strength in the man's forearms. It was like trying to bend a live oak branch. He ratcheted the cuffs down tight, ignoring the way the metal dug into the skin. He did the same to Thorne. As Cole shoved them into the cramped back seat of the cruiser, the smell of cheap aftershave and sour body odor wafted from his own uniform. He slammed the door, breathing heavy, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead. He looked at them through the plexiglass partition. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder, staring at him. Their eyes caught the ambient light of the dash. They weren't looking at him like he was a cop. They were looking at him like he was a math problem they had already solved. Cole swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry, and put the car in gear. The Oak Haven County precinct smelled eternally of pine sol and stale cigarette smoke, a scent baked deep into the yellowing acoustic tiles of the ceiling. Cole dumped Hale and Thorne's belongings onto the scratched metal counter of the booking desk. Sergeant Donnelly, a heavily overweight man who breathed with a wet rasp, barely looked up from his tablet. "What do we got, Cole?" Donnelly asked lazily, reaching for a pen. "DUI suspects. Uncooperative. Combative." Cole lied smoothly, stripping off his duty belt with a heavy sigh. "Refused a breathalyzer on the roadside. Lock them up until morning court." Donnelly dragged the 2 nylon wallets across the desk. He flipped one open, his eyes skimming the cards. "Military IDs," Donnelly muttered, pausing for a fraction of a second. "Department of Defense. Probably stolen, or their motor pool grunts playing tough." Cole grunted, rubbing his lower back. He didn't want to look at the cards. Looking meant paperwork. Looking meant acknowledging them as something other than a stat sheet. "Just process them, Stan. I'm going home to sleep." Hale and Thorne stood by the concrete wall, handcuffed to the rusty steel rail. They hadn't spoken a single word since being put in the cruiser. They watched the exchange with that same infuriatingly blank stare. When Donnelly asked them for their one phone call, Hale simply shook his head. "We'll wait for the judge," Hale said. It was an arrogant move, Cole thought, as he walked out into the muggy dawn. Stupid. Nobody survived Judge Everett Harlan's courtroom without a lawyer, especially not out-of-towners with an attitude problem. Hours later, Cole was back. His head pounded from lack of sleep, and the cheap diner sausage he'd eaten for breakfast sat like a lead weight in his gut. He adjusted his tie, a clip-on he only wore for court appearances, and pushed through the heavy wooden double doors of Oak Haven Municipal Court. The courtroom was a relic, all dark oak paneling and pew-style benches that creaked under the weight of nervous defendants. The air conditioning was broken, as it usually was, leaving the room smelling of old varnish, cheap perfume, and nervous perspiration. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight piercing the tall, grimy windows. Cole took his seat in the front row reserved for arresting officers. He flipped open his notepad. He hadn't bothered to write a proper report, just bullet points. Erratic driving, bloodshot eyes, smell of intoxicants, combative posture. It was the standard script he'd recited 100 times. Judge Everett Harlan, a man who viewed his courtroom as a toll booth for the county's revenue, never questioned it. A heavy wooden door beside the judge's bench opened, and the bailiff led the morning's holding cell occupants in. They were shackled together at the wrists and ankles, the heavy chains rattling against the hardwood floor. Hale and Thorne shuffled in. Their gray shirts were wrinkled from sleeping on concrete, but their posture remained entirely rigid. They didn't slouch. They didn't look at the floor. As they were guided to the defendant's table, Hale's eyes found Cole in the gallery. Cole felt a sudden, inexplicable cold prickle at the base of his neck. He shifted in his seat, crossing his legs to mask the slight jitter in his knee. Just two guys, he told himself. Just two loudmouths who are about to pay a massive fine and spend 30 days on a road crew. All rise, the bailiff droned, his voice utterly bored. Oak Haven Municipal Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Everett Harlan presiding. Harlan swept into the room, a small man swimming in his black robes. He climbed the steps to the bench, barely looking at the crowded room, and immediately began sorting through the files dumped on his desk. He took a sip from a ceramic mug, winced at the temperature, and grabbed his gavel. Sit, Harlan commanded. The gallery sat with a collective groan of shifting wood. Let's get through this. Call the first docket. Case number 44-09, the bailiff read, squinting at a piece of paper. State versus Julian Hale and Elias Thorne. Charges: driving under the influence, resisting arrest, failure to maintain lane. Harlan peered over his reading glasses at the two men standing before him. You boys have legal representation? No, Your Honor, Hale said. His voice echoed slightly in the cavernous room. We are representing ourselves. Harlan let out a dry, hacking laugh. Fool for a client, Mr. Hale. Officer Cole, you're the arresting officer? Cole stood up, smoothing the front of his uniform. Yes, Your Honor. Pulled the vehicle over late at night. The driver was swerving, refused field sobriety, refused a breathalyzer, became verbally combative during the stop. Standard procedure, then? Harlan muttered, scribbling something on his notepad. He didn't even look up at Hale or Thorne. Given the refusal of testing and the resisting charge, bail is set at $10,000 each, cash or surety. You boys can figure out how to pay it from the county lockup. Next case. Harlan reached for his gavel. Before the wood could strike the sounding block, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. It wasn't a slow creak. It was a violent, synchronized push that sent the brass handles slamming against the plaster walls with a concussive crack that made half the room flinch. Cole turned in his seat, his hand instinctively dropping toward his hip. The light pouring in from the hallway momentarily blinded him, but the silhouettes framed in the doorway made his stomach bottom out. Two men in dark suits stepped into the room holding the doors open. They wore earpieces and moved with terrifying precision. But it was the man who walked between them that made the air in the courtroom turn to ice. He was an older white man, tall, his spine perfectly straight. He wore the stark, blindingly crisp service dress blue uniform of the United States Navy. 3 thick gold stripes and 1 thin gold stripe wrapped around the cuffs of his sleeves. A massive rack of ribbons, bright and intimidating, sat above his left breast pocket, topped with the gold trident of special warfare. The heavy thud of his black Oxford shoes against the wooden floorboards sounded like gunshots in the dead, silent room. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at Cole. Admiral Victor Langford kept his eyes locked dead on Judge Harlan. And as Cole watched him walk down the center aisle, the metallic taste of sheer panic flooded the back of his throat. Nobody breathed. The ambient noise of the courtroom, the restless shuffling of shoes, the muffled coughs, the rhythmic squeak of the ceiling fan oscillating on a broken bearing, simply evaporated. Admiral Victor Langford stopped at the low wooden gate separating the gallery from the well of the court. He didn't push it open. He just stood there, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch until it became a physical pressure in the room. He looked at the chains binding Hale and Thorne. A microscopic tightening at the corner of his jaw was the only betrayal of emotion. Judge Harlan cleared his throat. It sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "Excuse me, sir. We are in the middle of a docket. You cannot interrupt." "Release them," Langford said. His voice didn't boom. It wasn't a theatrical shout. It was a flat, even baritone that carried perfectly across the humid air, carrying the absolute, unquestionable expectation of obedience. It was the voice of a man who moved aircraft carriers with a signature. Harlan's face flushed an ugly, mottled red. He gripped his gavel, his knuckles turning white, trying to salvage his fiefdom in front of a gallery of petty criminals and traffic violators. "I don't care who you are, sir, or what uniform you're wearing. You are in my courtroom. You will step back, or I will have you held in contempt." Langford finally looked at Harlan. He slowly reached inside his dark navy tunic and withdrew a thick, folded document. He didn't hand it over. He let it rest in his palm. "My name is Admiral Victor Langford, Commander, Naval Special Warfare Command." He said the words, clipping the stale air with mechanical precision. "You are currently holding Lieutenant Commander Julian Hale and Senior Chief Elias Thorne. They are active duty operators of SEAL Team 6. More importantly, Judge, they are currently under Title 10 federal orders returning to Naval Station Norfolk from a classified training rotation." Cole's stomach dropped. The cheap sausage he'd eaten earlier turned to battery acid in his throat. He looked at the two men standing in chains. SEALs. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the ribs. They hadn't been intimidated on the side of the road. They hadn't been scared. They had been entirely compliant because Cole was utterly beneath their threshold of threat. They had simply let him hang himself. "They were arrested," Harlan stammered, his eyes darting toward Cole, desperately looking for a lifeline. "Arrested for driving under the influence, resisting an officer, failure to maintain lane." "So your paperwork says," Langford replied. He took a single step forward, pushing the wooden gate open. It creaked loudly. The two men in suits, federal agents, Cole realized with a sickening spike of adrenaline, stepped in behind him, their eyes scanning the room, assessing the bailiff, then settling on Cole. "I have already spoken with the United States Attorney for this district," Langford continued, walking slowly toward the bench. His shoes scuffed softly against the hardwood. "And I have spoken with the director of the FBI. We are deeply interested in how two federal operators driving a federally leased vehicle who have not consumed alcohol in months due to deployment protocols were somehow intoxicated on your county highway." Harlan swallowed hard. The sweat on his forehead was catching the glare of the overhead lights. He looked down at Cole's handwritten affidavit, suddenly realizing it was essentially a piece of toilet paper wrapped around a live grenade. "Officer Cole?" Harlan's voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again, pitching it an octave lower. "Officer Cole swore to these facts. I am simply processing the arrest." Langford turned his head, his pale blue eyes locked onto Cole. Cole wanted to look away. He wanted to stare at the floorboards, but his neck felt locked in place. He was suddenly hyper-aware of his own uniform, the fraying thread on his shoulder patch, the tarnished brass of his nameplate, the sour smell of his own nervous sweat. He felt small, gross, exposed. "Officer Cole," Langford echoed, tasting the name, finding it bitter. "Did you administer a breathalyzer?" They refused," Cole managed to say. His mouth was so dry, his tongue stuck to the roof of his palate. "Did you administer a field sobriety test?" "Refused. They were combative." Cole hated how thin his voice sounded. It was a pathetic, reedy whine. "Combative?" Langford repeated softly. He looked at Hale, then at Thorne. They stood perfectly still, their hands chained to their waists, their faces impassive masks. If they had been combative, Cole knew deep down he would currently be in a trauma ward, breathing through a plastic tube. "Judge Harlan," Langford said, turning his back on Cole, entirely dismissing him as a non-entity. "You have exactly 2 minutes to dismiss these charges with prejudice, order the bailiff to unchain my men, and release them into my custody. If you do not, the agent standing behind me will place you, the bailiff, and Officer Cole under federal arrest for the deprivation of rights under color of law and obstruction of federal military orders." The courtroom was dead silent. A woman in the back row shifted her wooden bench, whining under the shifting weight. Cole felt a cold bead of sweat track slowly down his spine. Harlan looked at the federal agents. He looked at the brass on Langford's chest. Then he looked at Cole. The judge's eyes were cold, entirely devoid of the cynical camaraderie they usually shared when processing the county's poor. It was the look of a rat chewing off its own leg to escape a trap. "Charges dismissed," Harlan said quickly, slamming his gavel down so hard it bounced off the sounding block. "Bailiff, uncuff them." The bailiff, a retired county deputy with bad knees, fumbled his keys, his hands shaking as he approached Hale and Thorne. The heavy metallic clack of the padlocks opening echoed in the room. The chains pulled on the floor with a heavy final rattle. Hale rubbed his wrists, the metal having left deep red indents in his dark skin. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. He rolled his shoulders, the muscles beneath his wrinkled gray shirt shifting effortlessly. "Come with me, Commander," Langford said. They walked back down the center aisle. As Hale passed Cole's seat, he didn't stop, but he turned his head just a fraction. For a split second, Cole saw the absolute terrifying void in the man's eyes. It wasn't hatred. It was the complete absence of regard. Cole was nothing more than an insect that had buzzed too close to the windshield. The courtroom doors swung shut behind them, leaving Cole sitting alone in the front row, his lungs burning as he finally remembered to breathe. Fluorescent lights hummed a high, irritating pitch in the windowless interrogation room at the Oakhaven precinct. The air smelled of burnt coffee and ozone from the ancient copy machine down the hall. Cole sat at the scratched metal table, his hands folded tight in his lap. His fingernails dug half-moons into his own palms. Across from him sat Captain Morrison. Morrison was a thick-necked man who usually radiated a bullish confidence, but right now his uniform collar was unbuttoned, his tie was pulled loose, and he was sweating profusely. Standing in the corner, a silent monolith in his dark suit, was one of the federal agents who had accompanied the Admiral. A heavy black Dell laptop sat open on the table between Cole and his captain. "Harlan," Morrison said. His voice was a raspy whisper. He sounded exhausted. "Tell me you didn't do this." Cole looked at the scuffed linoleum floor. He noticed a dead spider curled into a tight ball near the baseboard. "They were swerving, Cap. I swear to God. I lit them up. They got mouthy. You know how these out-of-towners get. They think because they're military, the rules don't apply." Morrison dragged a heavy hand down his face, pulling the skin under his eyes tight. He didn't look like he believed a word of it. He reached out and tapped the spacebar on the laptop. The screen flared to life. It was the footage from Cole's own dashcam. The audio kicked in first, the muffled roar of the cruiser's engine, the static hiss of the police radio, the rhythmic oscillating screech of the cicadas outside. On the screen, The dark tree line of Route 11 rolled past. Up ahead, the taillights of the Chevy Tahoe glowed a dull, steady red. Cole watched his own lie unravel in harsh, pixelated detail. The Tahoe wasn't swerving. It was tracking a perfectly straight line, maintaining a flawless distance from the shoulder. The tires never touched the center rumble strip. The brake lights never fluttered. It was driving with a methodical, almost boring precision. "Look at them," Cole croaked, pointing a shaky finger at the screen. "Right there." He drifted. Morrison didn't look at Cole. He kept his eyes locked on the screen, his jaw muscles clenching and unclenching. The video showed the cruiser accelerating, the red and blue strobes violently washing over the Tahoe. The SUV pulled over immediately, executing a textbook stop onto the gravel shoulder. The audio picked up Cole's boots crunching on the gravel. Then his voice, distorted slightly by the cheap microphone. "License, registration, and proof of insurance. Keep your hands where I can see them." "Evening, officer." Hale's voice, calm, flat, entirely devoid of the aggression Cole had claimed in his report. They watched the entire interaction play out. They watched Cole artificially escalate the stop. They watched him strike the roof of the SUV with his flashlight. They watched him yank Hale's arms behind his back, securing the cuffs with unnecessary force. Through it all, Hale and Thorne never raised their voices. They never resisted. They simply let the abuse happen, letting the camera document every single violation of their civil rights. The video ended. The screen went black, reflecting Cole's pale, sweat-slicked face back at him. The silence in the interrogation room was heavier than the one in the courtroom. It was the silence of a career ending, the silence of a life being dismantled piece by piece. "Harlan," Morrison finally said, his voice devoid of any anger. It was just incredibly sad. "Your affidavit says they crossed the double yellow twice. It says they smelled of alcohol. It says they actively resisted arrest, requiring physical force to subdue." "It was dark," Cole stammered. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth, but his survival instinct, battered and pathetic as it was, kept trying to dig out of the grave. "I thought I smelled something. I had reasonable suspicion." "Stop," the federal agent in the corner said. It was the first time the man had spoken. His voice was smooth, polished, and terrifyingly cold. "Just stop talking, Officer Cole. You are only adding perjury to your list of federal indictments." Morrison sighed, closing the laptop with a soft click. He sat back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Give me your badge, Harlan, and your sidearm. You're stripped of all police powers effective immediately pending a full investigation by Internal Affairs and the Department of Justice." Cole's hands trembled as he reached for his duty belt. He had worn it for years. It had molded to the shape of his hips. It was the only thing that gave him weight in the world. He unclipped the heavy brass buckle. The leather groaned in protest. He pulled it off. The radio, the taser, the Glock 19, the spare magazines, all clattering heavily onto the metal table. It sounded like a casket closing. He unpinned the silver star from his chest, his fingers clumsy, pricking his thumb on the sharp needle. A tiny drop of blood welled up. He placed the badge next to the gun. "You're a disgrace, Cole," Morrison muttered, looking at the badge, unable to meet Cole's eyes. "You pulled over 2 black men in a nice car because you figured they'd be an easy stat. You didn't even bother to check their IDs before you locked them up. You just saw what you wanted to see." "My back," Cole started, trying to find some excuse, some medical justification for his cruelty. "My back was killing me. I was tired, Cap. I wasn't thinking straight." "Get out of my precinct," Morrison said, his voice finally hardening into something sharp and unforgiving. "The DOJ will be in touch regarding your arraignment. Have a lawyer ready. You're going to need a miracle." Cole stood up. Without the duty belt, he felt impossibly light, as if a strong gust of wind could knock him over. He walked toward the door, his legs feeling like they were made of damp sawdust. He opened the heavy metal door and stepped out into the busy hallway of the precinct. Detectives and patrol officers were moving about, carrying files, drinking coffee. But as Cole walked past, they stopped. Conversations died. Eyes tracked him. Nobody offered a sympathetic nod. Nobody clapped him on the shoulder. He was radioactive. He pushed through the front glass doors of the station and stepped out into the brutal, blinding afternoon heat of Oak Haven. The sun pounded against his face. He walked to his personal car, a rusted-out Ford sedan that desperately needed new shocks. He unlocked the door and sat behind the wheel. The steering wheel burned his palms. Cole looked at himself in the rearview mirror. He saw the graying hair at his temples, the deep, bitter lines around his mouth, the hollow panic in his eyes. He thought about the absolute, terrifying stillness of the two men in the back of his cruiser. He thought about the Admiral's voice. He had thought he was the predator prowling his small stretch of highway, taking bites out of the weak. He rested his forehead against the searing hot steering wheel and closed his eyes. The heat bugs screamed in the trees, a deafening, endless wall of noise as Cole finally realized he had never been the wolf. He was just a stray dog that had wandered into a tiger cage. In the days that followed, the smell of rotting takeout and unwashed laundry dominated Cole's cramped duplex. He sat in a sagging recliner, staring at the muted television screen, a glass of cheap room-temperature bourbon sweating in his hand. The ice had melted hours ago, leaving a watery amber film that tasted like copper and regret. His phone hadn't rung once. Not a single text from the guys on the night shift. Not a check-in from the union rep. In the tightly knit ecosystem of Oak Haven law enforcement, Cole had gone from a veteran operator to a biological hazard overnight. Nobody wanted the DOJ sniffing around their own questionable collars, so they amputated him fast and clean. He took a sip of the warm liquor and winced as it burned a trail down his throat. His lower back screamed at him, a constant dull throb that flared into sharp agony whenever he shifted his weight. Without his department-issued health insurance, the steroid injections he relied on were suddenly out of reach. He was broke, physically deteriorating, and staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. In the afternoon, he dragged himself out of the chair, put on a wrinkled button-down shirt that smelled faintly of mildew, and drove to a strip mall on the edge of the county line. Preston Hale's law office sat between a failing nail salon and a predatory payday lender. The waiting room consisted of 2 plastic chairs and a dying ficus plant. Hale himself was a sweaty, high-strung man in his late 50s who breathed entirely through his mouth. He was the kind of attorney who handled messy divorces and third-offense DUIs, not federal civil rights violations, but he was the only lawyer Cole could afford with the dwindling balance in his checking account. "Have a seat, Harlan," Hale said, dropping a thick manila folder onto a desk cluttered with empty coffee cups and stacked legal pads. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting a sickly, strobing pallor over the room. Cole sat. The vinyl chair sighed loudly under his weight. "Tell me you got a hold of the AUSA." "I did," Hale said, collapsing into his own chair. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He didn't look at Cole. He looked at the folder. "I spoke with Assistant United States Attorney Bradley this morning." "And?" Cole leaned forward, his heart knocking an erratic, painful rhythm against his ribs. "What's the plea?" "I'll take a misdemeanor. Obstruction. Official misconduct. I'll surrender my post-certification permanently. Just keep me out of county." Hale finally looked up. His eyes were utterly devoid of pity. "Harlan, you aren't dealing with the county prosecutor. You don't have leverage. You don't have chips to call in." He tapped the folder with a fat, nicotine-stained finger. "They are charging you under 18 U.S.C. Section 242. Deprivation of rights under color of law. 2 counts. Plus federal perjury and falsifying official records." Cole's mouth went bone dry. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt lined with sandpaper. "Federal? They're actually bringing federal charges over a bad traffic stop." "It wasn't a bad traffic stop," Hale suddenly shouted, slamming his palm on the desk. The coffee cups rattled. "You handcuffed 2 active-duty Navy SEALs without probable cause, lied on a sworn affidavit, and tried to extort them through the municipal court system. You humiliated the United States military on camera, Harlan. The DOJ isn't looking for a plea deal. They are looking for a public execution." The air in the cramped office suddenly felt too thick to breathe. Cole felt a cold sweat prickling at his hairline. "What are we looking at?" "Maximum," Hale sighed, the brief flash of anger leaving him entirely deflated. 10 years per count on the civil rights violations, 5 for the perjury. Realistically, if we go to trial and lose, and we will lose, Harlan, because the video is in 1080p and you look like a goddamn stormtrooper, you're looking at 4 to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Cole stared at a water stain on the ceiling tiles. 4 to 5 years. He was in his 40s with a bad spine and a resume consisting solely of bullying teenagers and harassing transient drivers. 4 to 5 years in federal lockup as a former cop. He wouldn't survive half of that. "What do I do, Preston?" Cole whispered. His voice broke, sounding small, pathetic. "Get your affairs in order," Hale said, sliding a billing invoice across the desk. "They're going to convene a grand jury by the end of the week. Warrants will follow. Don't run. Don't do anything stupid. When they come for you, go quietly." Cole left the office in a daze. The afternoon sun was blinding, reflecting off the asphalt parking lot in harsh, undulating waves of heat. He got into his car, gripped the steering wheel, and dry-heaved until his stomach cramped. That night, seeking any semblance of his old life, he drove to O'Malley's. It was a dark, divey cop bar where Cole had spent the better part of a decade drinking for free, protected by the invisible shield of his badge. He walked in craving the familiar smell of stale popcorn and spilled draft beer. He took a stool at the end of the bar. Danny the bartender was wiping down the taps. He looked up, saw Cole, and immediately stopped smiling. "Hey, Danny," Cole said, trying to force a casual tone. "Just a maker's neat." Danny didn't move. He threw his bar towel over his shoulder. "Can't do it, Harlan." Cole frowned. "What do you mean? You're out of makers." "I mean I can't serve you," Danny said, his voice low but hard enough that the 2 off-duty deputies sitting a few stools down turned to look. "Morrison called. Said if you showed up, I'm to tell you you're permanently 86th. You're bad for business. Sorry." Cole sat frozen. He looked at the 2 deputies. He knew them. He had backed them up on a domestic dispute call months ago. One of them met Cole's gaze for a fraction of a second before looking down at his phone, actively ignoring him. The heat in Cole's face was unbearable. He wasn't a cop anymore. He wasn't a regular. He was an infection. He stood up, the legs of the wooden stool scraping loudly against the floorboards. Without a word, he turned and walked out into the humid night, feeling the total crushing weight of his newfound irrelevance. Heavy fists pounded against his front door at dawn. Cole was already awake. He hadn't slept in days. He was lying on his sofa, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic mocking tick of the wall clock. When the pounding started, it didn't sound like a knock. It sounded like a battering ram testing the hinges. "FBI, open the door!" A voice boomed deep and distorted by the heavy wood. Cole rolled off the sofa. His legs felt like lead. He dragged his feet across the cheap carpet, his breath hitching in his chest. Before his hand could even reach the deadbolt, the door violently kicked inward. The wood splintered around the frame, the deadbolt tearing cleanly through the jamb. 5 men in dark olive tactical vests and Kevlar helmets flooded into the narrow living room. The beams of their mounted weapon lights sliced through the morning shadows, blinding him. The smell of gun oil and sweat filled the space instantly. "Hands! Show me your hands!" Cole dropped to his knees instinctively. He raised his hands, empty fingers splayed wide. He knew the drill. Any sudden twitch, any reaching motion, and they would drop him. He felt a heavy boot plant itself firmly against his lower back, right on the damaged L4 vertebra. He cried out a pathetic, sharp yelp of pain as rough hands grabbed his wrists and wrenched them behind him. The cold steel of handcuffs ratcheted tightly over his skin. They bit deep, pinching the nerves. "Harlan Cole, you are under arrest pursuant to a federal warrant." A man standing above him read, his voice devoid of any adrenaline. It was just a morning chore for him. They hauled Cole to his feet. He was in a faded gray t-shirt and boxer shorts. He shivered despite the muggy morning air leaking in through the shattered doorframe. They didn't let him dress. They threw a coarse nylon jacket over his shoulders and marched him out to a waiting black SUV. His neighbors were standing on their porches watching. Mrs. Gable from next door, whom Cole had once threatened with a citation for her overgrown hedges, stood on her lawn in her bathrobe watching him get shoved into the back of the federal vehicle. She didn't look shocked. She looked satisfied. The ride to the federal courthouse in the city took an hour. Cole stared at the metal cage separating him from the agents in the front. He remembered looking at Hale and Thorne in his own rearview mirror, remembering their terrifying, stony silence. Now Cole couldn't stop his hands from shaking. The metal chains rattled constantly against the hard plastic seat. Processing was a sterile, degrading nightmare. There was no sergeant to joke with, no familiar smells of the precinct. There was only the harsh fluorescent glare of the federal lockup, the smell of industrial bleach, and the cold mechanical efficiency of the U.S. Marshals. He was stripped, searched, sprayed with delousing chemical that burned his skin, and dressed in a bright neon orange jumpsuit that felt like stiff cardboard. Canvas slip-on shoes replaced his boots. By midday, he was chained to 6 other federal inmates, a mix of meth manufacturers and stone-faced gang enforcers, and led through the concrete bowels of the courthouse. The federal courtroom was a cathedral compared to the rotting municipal court in Oak Haven. Polished mahogany, soaring 20-foot ceilings, and thick carpets that swallowed the sound of their shuffling canvas shoes. Cole was directed to the defense table. Preston Hale was already there, sweating through his collar, looking entirely out of his depth. "Stand straight," Hale hissed as Cole slumped into the chair. "Judge Langford is a hanging judge." Cole looked around the gallery. He had half expected Admiral Langford to be there, or the 2 SEALs sitting in the back row watching him burn. But the gallery was empty, save for a few bored-looking law clerks and a sketch artist. The realization hit Cole harder than the raid had. Hale, Thorne, the Admiral. They didn't care about this. They hadn't come to gloat because Cole wasn't a rival. He wasn't an enemy worthy of their attention. He was just a piece of garbage they had stepped in, wiped off their boots, and forgotten about. They were back to their classified deployments, moving through the world with absolute purpose, while Cole was being disposed of by the federal janitorial staff. "All rise," the courtroom deputy announced. Judge Langford emerged. She was a severe woman, with iron gray hair pulled into a tight bun, moving with sharp, impatient energy. She sat, adjusted her glasses, and opened the thick file in front of her. "United States versus Harlan Cole," she read, her voice echoing perfectly through the acoustic paneling of the room. Charges of Title 18, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights. Mr. Hale, how does your client plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Hale said. It sounded weak. The prosecutor, a young, razor-sharp assistant U.S. attorney named Bradley, stood up. He didn't even look at Cole. The government requests remand, Your Honor. The defendant is a former law enforcement officer facing substantial federal time. He has demonstrated a willingness to falsify official records and abuse his authority. He is a flight risk and a danger to the integrity of the judicial process. Mr. Hale, the judge prompted. My client has deep ties to the community, Your Honor, Hale stammered. He served as a police officer for years. We request a reasonable bond. Judge Langford looked over her glasses, her gaze pinning Cole to his chair. It was the same look he used to give the teenagers he caught drinking by the quarry. Complete dismissive contempt. A police officer who uses his badge to target citizens and falsify federal documents has no ties to the community that this court respects, Langford said coldly. The evidence presented in the affidavit, specifically the dashboard camera footage, is overwhelming. Bond is denied. The defendant is remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals pending trial. She slammed the gavel. It didn't bounce like Judge Harlan's. It struck the block with a heavy, definitive crack that sounded like a vault door locking shut. The marshals moved in immediately. They grabbed Cole by the biceps, hauling him up from the chair. He looked at Hale, but the lawyer was already packing his briefcase, not meeting his eye. As they marched him toward the heavy wooden door leading back to the holding cells, the chains around his ankles dragging against the beautiful pristine carpet, Cole smelled the sour scent of his own terror. The heavy door clicked open, revealing the dark concrete hallway waiting to swallow him whole. Concrete dust permanently settled in the creases of Cole's knuckles. It didn't matter how hard he scrubbed with the abrasive, lie-heavy commissary soap. The gray grit was part of him now, worked deep into his pores alongside the stagnant scent of industrial bleach and unwashed bodies hanging in the ventilation of FCY Morgantown. Months later, there was no dramatic trial, no grandstand speech where he tried to justify his actions to a jury. The federal machine didn't work like that. It ground you down in windowless conference rooms with plea agreements that read like stereo instructions. Hale hadn't even shown up to the final meeting. He sent a junior associate who chewed peppermint gum while the assistant U.S. attorney slid the paperwork across the table. 54 months. Cole signed it with a cheap plastic pen that bent under his grip. He signed away his pension, his freedom, and his name simply because he was too exhausted to fight a war he had already lost on the shoulder of Route 11. Now he was inmate 88419-054. He worked laundry and sanitation. It was a detail assigned because his deteriorating L4 vertebra meant he couldn't lift anything over 20 pounds. The prison doctor, an indifferent contractor, prescribed generic ibuprofen and told him to stretch. The heat in the laundry room was oppressive, a wet, clinging force that made the stiff orange fabric of his uniform stick to his spine. Cole dragged a heavy canvas hamper across the cracked linoleum floor, the caster wheels squealing a high, rhythmic pitch. He stopped, leaning heavily against the lip of a massive industrial washing machine, gasping. His lower back was a tight, burning knot of agony. He squeezed his eyes shut, tasting the salty runoff of his own sweat on his upper lip. "Keep it moving, Cole," a voice barked over the hum of the dryers. It was Officer Hemlock, a thick-necked guard who chewed toothpicks and looked at Cole with undisguised revulsion. In prison, ex-cops were the lowest caste, but a corrupt cop caught on his own dashcam, he was a liability. He made them all look bad. Cole didn't talk back. He didn't puff out his chest. He just swallowed his pride, gripped the edge of the hamper with aching fingers, and pushed. "Yes, sir," he mumbled. At evening chow, After a dinner of processed turkey meat that tasted vaguely of cardboard, Cole sat in the corner of the day room. It was a cavernous space filled with bolted-down metal tables and the echoing cacophony of 100 men. 2 televisions hung in protective cages from the ceiling. Cole held a damp rag. He was supposed to wipe down the tables before lockdown, busy work to keep him out of the way of the shot callers. He sprayed a mist of diluted sanitizer onto the sticky metal surface of a table and wiped it away, picking up breadcrumbs and dried coffee rings. He glanced up at the television on the left. The volume was muted, closed captions flashing rapidly. Pentagon press briefing. Hostage recovery in Yemen. Cole stopped wiping. The rag hung loosely from his fingers. The screen showed a podium, then quickly cut to grainy green-tinted night vision aerial footage. Little white heat signatures moved with terrifying synchronized speed, breaching a compound wall, clearing a courtyard, loading into a helicopter. Naval Special Warfare elements conduct successful night raid. He stared at the green shapes. They were ghosts operating in the dark, executing violence with a precision Cole couldn't comprehend. He thought about the driver, Julian Hale. He thought about the passenger, Elias Thorne. He remembered how calm they had been when he pressed them against his cruiser. He had thought they were compliant because they were scared of his badge, scared of his gun. Looking at the silent, lethal efficiency playing out on the screen, the humiliating reality settled deep into Cole's bones. They hadn't been scared. They were apex predators taking a brief pause on a quiet highway, tolerating a loud, buzzing insect because swatting it would have taken more effort than it was worth. They had let him build his own gallows and pull the lever himself. "Hey, garbage man," Cole blinked. Garrus, a large man serving 20 years for meth trafficking, stood by the table holding an empty plastic juice cup. Garrus dropped it onto the wet metal surface Cole had just cleaned, leaving a sticky orange ring. "You missed a spot, officer," Garrus sneered, showing rotting teeth. A year ago, Cole would have planted a knee in his spine and tightened the cuffs until the man's hands went numb. He felt the phantom weight of his gun belt twitch, but the belt was gone. The badge was in an evidence locker. Cole looked at Garrus. He looked at the orange ring. He didn't say a word. He just picked up his dirty rag, leaned over, and wiped the table clean again. "Good boy," Garrus laughed, walking away. Cole stood in the center of the noisy room, entirely alone. The dull ache in his back flared. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered, casting a sickly yellow hue over the concrete. He breathed in the smell of the bleach on his hands, realizing this was the rest of his life. He wasn't a hard-nosed cop who got a raw deal. He was exactly what Morrison had called him, a bully who picked on the weak, blind to the monsters in the world who didn't need a badge to be dangerous. The loud electronic buzzer sounded for lockdown. The heavy metal grates at the end of the hall began to roll shut with a deafening crash. He tossed the dirty rag into his plastic bucket and began the slow, agonizing shuffle back to his cell. Just another ghost in a cage, entirely forgotten by the men who had put him there.